Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the new Statesman's deputy online editor Rachel Cunliffe and the Daily Telegraph's deputy political editor Lucy Fisher. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. The Metro points out that by the time it's published, there will be only 7 days to go until US President Joe Biden's deadline to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. The Financial Times looks ahead to Tuesday's G7 meeting, suggesting President Biden will come under severe pressure from key Western allies, including the UK, to extend that deadline. The Eye has the headline, US and Britain on collision course with the Taliban. That race against time is also the top story for The Guardian. The Telegraph hears that a person on the UK's no-fly watch list made it onto a military flight to Birmingham but was stopped before officially setting foot on British soil. And it's the same lead story for The Mail, which also pictures the twin girls who featured in our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey's report this evening. And we're joined tonight by Rachel Cunliffe and Lucy Fisher. Let's turn to the Eye first, Lucy. And we've got the G7 summit coming up tomorrow. Boris Johnson and other European leaders to put pressure on Joe Biden over this August the 31st deadline. But the Taliban says, no, that's it.
Well, that's right. We've seen the situation at Kabul airport become increasingly chaotic in recent days, and now the diplomatic tensions among the Western allies is becoming increasingly fraught too as they exit. As you point out, we've got this emergency G7 call tomorrow at which we expect the Prime Minister, along with Emmanuel Macron, the French president, to really lead efforts to try and persuade Joe Biden to remain in Kabul beyond the August the 31st deadline for finishing off the evacuation process. We know from all the mood music coming out of Washington that the Americans aren't keen at the moment on extending that deadline. Even if there is agreement, an unexpected breakthrough tomorrow at this G7 meeting, then there's the issue of facing negotiations with the Taliban. So far, Suhail Shaheen, the spokesman, has said that it's a red line for the Taliban the end of this month, and they aren't minded to grant any extension. It's quite a humiliating position for the West to be in, that they could be pleading with the Taliban to extend this and yet see that vetoed.
And this extension, even just a couple of days, Rachel, could mean thousands of lives being saved.
Well, definitely. Just in the last 24 hours, the US were able to fly out 10,000 people. So if you look at that on a scale of a couple of days of extension or even a couple of hours of extension, we are talking about hundreds or even thousands of additional lives being saved. The issue, as Lucy says, is it's not something for the West to negotiate among themselves. A lot of the papers have the pressure on Joe Biden and on the US regime from various Western powers, the British, the French, the Canadians and others. But even if the US, Washington, decided to change its mind, even if anyone could change Joe Biden's mind, the prospect of the West, led by the US, going cap in hand to the Taliban and saying, please let us stay a few extra days, especially when we've had this very strong pushback from a Taliban spokesperson, I'm not sure any US administration would want to take that risk of going and asking for that extra time and then being told no. Imagine the optics of that, and imagine the optics of a new Taliban regime being able to say, in our first days in power, we were able to push back the US in this way. And that's why I think that even though the pressure is mounting, the tensions are very, very, very high. And the idea that we'll be able to get everyone out who the British and the Americans want to get out, I think sadly may not come to pass.
Lucy, if we have a look at The Guardian, I mean, it has a photograph of the very orderly lines as those who have made it through line up to get onto transporter planes. Marked contrast to the scenes we've seen out of the airport. But that warning that was given by the Taliban in an interview with Sally Lockwood earlier today, that staying past the deadline would cross a red line and provoke a reaction. It does put the West in a very difficult position ahead of that summit. Boris Johnson saying very strongly he was going to push for this. And Meanwhile, outside, thousands and thousands of people continue to wait.
Well, that's right. After 20 years being in Afghanistan, the UK and the US can only at the moment hold the perimeter of Kabul airport, and only that at the consent of the Taliban. It's been a fascinating spectacle to see British troops basically being watched over by Taliban officers crouching on roofs from surveillance points around the airport. My understanding is from Whitehall sources that the Taliban, have been helpful on the ground, for example, in splitting up the queues of people looking to leave via US routes and via UK routes into different gates. Of course, that does contrast with some of the appalling reports we've heard coming from the ground, from Sky News and others, about Afghans waiting outside the perimeter fence, being crushed, facing beatings, lashings from Taliban officials waiting there. So it is a very, very fraught situation. As Rachel said, we're seeing lots of people, up to thousands per day, being evacuated in the past 24 hours. The US have got out 10,000 people. The UK, another valiant effort, another 1,800. But there are still many, many people left. And of course, if we are only there another 7 days before that August the 31st deadline, then it will be the case, as we've seen Ben Wallace say, choked with emotion, that sadly some people, many people possibly, will be left behind.
At the front of the Telegraph, Lucy's byline there, Rachel, on the news that one security suspect managed to get to the UK from Kabul.
Well, I'll let Lucy do more on this than I will, given that it's her story. But one of the things that struck me reading this is just the chaos, the chaotic scenes that we are seeing at the airport, the footage that we're getting, the stories that we're getting as well of very, very brave UK officials who are trying to process applications and visas and passports as quickly as they possibly can with an absolute skeleton staff. The sheer numbers of people who are desperately trying to catch a flight out, some of whom may not have all their documents in order, because why would you if you fled with next to nothing? And as a result of all that chaos and all of that pressure, I think it is sadly inevitable that there will be people trying to get through who perhaps shouldn't be. Certainly these were 5 individuals on the no-fly list who attempted to get through. 4 of them were stopped. 1 of them made it onto the plane. And I just think it speaks to the pressure that officials are under, and also sadly that if various Western countries are staging this mass evacuation effort, which is what they're doing, of course there are going to be people who take advantage of that, either for their own personal reasons because they're desperate, or in a more sinister way because they wish to do harm to the countries that they are seeking asylum in.
Yeah, and Lucy, give us a bit more detail then about what happened in this particular case.
Yes, well, this was a story that was broken by Sky News' Sam Coates earlier today. A briefing for MPs from Sir Laurie Bristow, the UK ambassador in Kabul at the moment, helping those emergency efforts to process visas for Afghans fleeing, told MPs today that one suspect on the UK's no-fly list had made it on board a flight. The UK Border Force authorities were alerted overnight. The individual has been arrested in Birmingham. But it will raise further questions about the security implications of the UK's plans to take in 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan over the next 5 years. I think we've seen so many, often young soldiers, let alone trained consular staff on the ground in Kabul, trying to carry out this really important work under such tough, difficult circumstances. They are to be applauded for what they're doing. But it's interesting, there's questions tonight about how much support they're getting from the Foreign Office. I spoke to Tobias Ellwood, the Tory chairman of the Commons Defence Select Committee. He said that once the UK had secured the airport site and its evacuation plan, agreed that with the Taliban, Border Force staff should have been sent out there to really help this process through. As it is, officials are insisting that the person caught coming into the UK shows that the databases are working, that the processes in place to catch these people that shouldn't be allowed into the country are working well. But I still think that there are questions to be answered about about the processes on the ground and how it's going to work going forward, particularly in this last scramble in the days coming up.
Yeah, and the latest update on that is that the Home Office has confirmed that upon further investigation, this individual is no longer a person of interest to the security agencies or law enforcement. It does raise questions about, as you say, how they could have got on the flight, but also others who are on a no-fly list in Kabul still who may not need to be now. Let's just turn to the Mail, which has very emotive images on its front page. It has twin girls who featured in Stuart Ramsey's report who have made it through and are on a flight back to Britain. Alongside that, the images of a brother and sister that were seen by an ITV News team, I believe, who it is understood have been left behind after their parents managed to get through in the scramble. I mean, it is devastating, the scenes that we are seeing out there. We've seen missing children posters, we've seen babies being handed over barbed wire. This is a humanitarian crisis, Rachel, on an unprecedented scale.
Yes, and I think it's the children aspect, obviously, that is incredibly emotive, as it always is. But those images as well of, as you said, children being passed over fences, similar to the images of the helicopter out of Saigon and parents lifting up their infant children in the hope that they could get away. Also seeing reports, we've seen reports in the last few days of people being shot and sadly dying at the airport in that mad crush to people trying to get through, and reports of people being told, even if they do have a visa or a passport, or they are meant to be on one of those flights, being told not even to attempt to go to the airport because of the chaos there. So even though in the previous paper we saw the order or the semblance of order there, we shouldn't forget that this is an incredibly chaotic semi-war zone, or about to become a war zone. And one of the lines in the Mail story just struck me, which is that the UK is trying to get out 6,000 people before the deadline at the end of the month. Really, the number they'd want to get out is 7,000. So that's 1,000 people at least whom UK officials think should be in this country and deserve to be in this country and would like to get out, but they just know won't be able to. And that's 1,000 people. That is a lot of people who we're unable to save because of the timing of this retreat and the way it's all been handled.
Rachel, Lucy, we're going to take a brief pause. Coming up after the break, the school summer holidays are nearly over, but is COVID under enough control to ensure children's safe return? We'll be discussing that next. Welcome back. You're watching The Press Preview. With me now, Rachel Cunliffe and Lucy Fisher. We're going to return to the front of The Guardian now, Rachel, for its coverage on the coronavirus pandemic and the prospect of schools returning.
Yes, so the schools are going back in just over a week, and was it 2 weeks? Soon. Schools are going back soon, and the death rate is at 100 of a 7-day average, which is kind of the highest it's been all summer. And obviously the hope during summer was that the vaccine rollout would mean that even though cases might go up, hospitalizations and deaths wouldn't. And they're still only at a tenth of where they were during the winter peak, but still deaths are creeping up to such an extent that there are concerns about schools going back and the increased transmission when that happens. Now, the rules changed over the summer, which meant that double-vaxxed adults and children, crucially children whether they had vaccinations or not, would no longer have to self-isolate if they came into contact with a positive case, which was meant to enable schools to go back and open in person without the mass absences and the pingdemic that we saw in the last few weeks of the summer term, when we had hundreds of thousands of school children who weren't actually attending. This is The Guardian raising the first warning signs that maybe the return to school may not be quite as smooth as parents and teachers and government officials are hoping, which just fills me with terror, partly as someone who will have to handle it if schools close again, but also because the amount of disrupted learning that our children have undergone over the last 18 months, how much they've missed out on, particularly the poorest and the most disadvantaged students who haven't been able to learn online. I think it's an absolute national scandal. And the fact that we're getting to just weeks before term time, realizing that there might be a certain amount of disruption yet again, just the lack of planning in the education department, I think is atrocious, to something that we should all be worrying about.
Yeah, I share your fears. There was a real hope, wasn't there, that for all our children's sakes, that they could return to some degree of normality in September. Let's see. Lucy, to the Metro now. Anti-vaxxers storming ITN's building.
Yeah, this isn't the first time we've seen anti-vax protesters making a stand at a broadcaster. We had a similar episode only a matter of weeks ago when another BBC studio was stormed. Today, Jon Snow, 73-year-old broadcaster, was led past the protesters by security, who attacked him, shouting at him about his coverage of the pandemic. Other demonstrators were heard to shout for Robert Peston. I just think, peaceful protest, I'm all for, and is a right that must be defended. But the increase we're seeing in people coming to buildings, coming to people's places of employment in a bid, frankly, to intimidate them is unacceptable.
Yeah, and ITN saying that their journalists have been prevented from doing their jobs as a result. Let's just have one quick look at the Telegraph, a story on the front, right at the bottom there, Rachel, before we go, about a tortoise hunting and killing a chick.
So this is actually, I love a good animal story, even though this is, sadly, a chick has been eaten by a tortoise. But it's so cool, not for the chick, obviously, but this is the first evidence of a tortoise killing and eating a live animal. So this is new information that we're learning about tortoises. And it's got this lovely last line at the end where it says, the lack of speed and dexterity mean they are still, sadly, one of the least efficient predators on the planet, which I think is a bit harsh, given that this tortoise has just made history by eating this bird. Yeah, I love a good animal story, even if it involves dead baby animals. And I think tortoises are really, really cool. And I used to desperately want one as a pet. Although now, having read this, I think possibly they're a bit aggressive for me.